"Doctor, that man has 2 wedding rings." The whisper was so quiet it should have disappeared beneath the steady rhythm of the heart monitor, but inside operating room 7, it landed like thunder. Every gloved hand stopped. The bright surgical lights burned across polished steel, the air smelled of antiseptic and warm machinery, and the silence stretched just long enough for everyone to look at the woman who had spoken. Nia Brooks stood beside the instrument table, her dark eyes fixed on the patient, her breathing calm even as every heartbeat around her seemed to quicken. Dr. Ethan Caldwell slowly turned toward her. His pale blue eyes narrowed above his mask. He was the hospital's celebrated chief surgeon, the man whose name appeared in medical journals and television interviews. He was also a man who believed that nobody questioned him once the operation began. Especially not a nurse. "Did I ask for your opinion?" he said, his voice low enough to cut through the frozen room. A nervous chuckle escaped one of the residents. Another looked away, pretending to study the monitor. Nia did not answer immediately. She simply kept staring at the unconscious man lying beneath the surgical drapes. The patient's left hand rested outside the blanket. 2 gold wedding bands reflected the harsh white light. Ethan followed her gaze for only a fraction of a second before shaking his head. "You are here to hand me instruments," he said. "Nothing more." The words stung harder than the cold air flowing from the ceiling vents. Several nurses lowered their eyes. They had heard that tone before. Everyone knew Dr. Caldwell's temper. Everyone knew what happened to staff members who embarrassed him. Nia felt dozens of eyes pressing against her shoulders, waiting for her to apologize, to step back, to disappear. Instead, she took one careful breath. Somewhere behind her, a ventilator released a slow mechanical sigh. A suction machine hummed softly. Rubber saws squeaked across the spotless floor as a circulating nurse shifted nervously near the door. "Doctor," Nia said again, her voice steady. "Mr. Daniel Harris told me yesterday that he never removes his wedding ring because his wife placed it on his finger the day he survived cancer. He only wears one." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Enough." The single word echoed across the room. "Security can remove you after this procedure." One of the younger surgeons gave her a look that mixed pity with embarrassment. Another quietly reached for the scalpel tray, eager for the operation to continue. The clock above the door ticked toward the scheduled incision time. Every passing second placed another life at risk. Nia's pulse finally quickened, but not from fear. Something deeper refused to let her stay silent. She remembered helping this patient into his room the night before. She remembered the photograph of his wife taped inside his chart. She remembered laughing with him as he proudly lifted one hand and joked that after 40 years of marriage, one ring was heavy enough. That memory would not leave her. Ethan extended his hand without looking away from the surgical field. "Scalpel." Nobody moved. The entire room waited. Nia stared once more at the hand resting beneath the operating light. Then she noticed something else. Tiny. Almost invisible. A faded scar across the knuckle was missing. Her stomach tightened. She stepped forward before anyone could stop her. "Doctor," she whispered one last time, "if you make that first incision, you will be operating on the wrong man." Ethan finally looked directly into the patient's wristband, and the color slowly drained from his face. No one breathed. The bright monitor cast a pale green glow across Ethan Caldwell's face as his eyes locked onto the identification band around the patient's wrist. For the first time in years, his hand refused to move. The stainless steel scalpel hovered inches above the drape, while the steady beep of the heart monitor suddenly sounded louder than anyone remembered. "Scan it," Nia said quietly. Ethan looked at her as if she had crossed an invisible line. "Do not tell me how to run my operating room." His words were sharp, but something had changed. The certainty behind them was gone. A surgical resident shifted uneasily. "Doctor, maybe we should verify." Ethan's glare silenced him instantly. The room became painfully still again. Warm air drifted from the ceiling vents while sweat gathered beneath every mask. Nia felt her palms dampen inside her gloves, yet she never looked away from the patient's hand. The missing scar. The second ring. Neither belonged to Daniel Harris. Ethan reached for the chart himself, flipping pages with quick, irritated movements. Blood type matched. Age matched. Consent forms matched. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. You wasted enough time, he muttered, extending his hand once more. Scalpel. Nia swallowed. Every instinct told her to stay silent now. Every rule inside the hospital demanded obedience. But another memory pushed through the fear. Less than 12 hours earlier, Daniel had smiled as she adjusted his blanket. Tomorrow, he had whispered, my wife will finally stop worrying. Then he had squeezed her hand with the same left hand that carried only one gold band. Nia's heartbeat pounded against her ribs. Ask him his birthday, she said. Several people stared at her in disbelief. One circulating nurse actually covered her mouth. Ethan's patience snapped. He is under anesthesia. Exactly. Her voice remained calm. Someone sedated him before anyone asked him to confirm his identity. Ethan frowned. That protocol should never have been skipped. He glanced toward the anesthesiologist. Did you verify? The older physician blinked. Preoperative intake said identification was already completed downstairs. Downstairs. Ethan slowly turned toward the electronic record displayed on the wall monitor. Timestamps flashed across the screen. Admission. Transfer. Sedation. Elevator arrival. His eyes narrowed. One transfer had occurred 7 minutes later than scheduled. 7 unexplained minutes. The room suddenly felt colder. Pull the hallway cameras, Ethan ordered. Nobody moved. The information technology technician was not even inside the operating suite. No, he repeated louder this time. Outside the operating room, hurried footsteps echoed across the polished hallway. Inside, no one dared touch the patient. Nia watched Ethan's expression shift from irritation to calculation. He zoomed into the electronic chart. 2 patients. Same age. Similar height. Similar last names. Harris. Harrison. Different surgeries. Different floors. His fingers stopped moving. The color faded from his face. This cannot be, he whispered. One of the residents leaned closer to the screen. Doctor. His voice cracked. The transplant patient never arrived. Every head turned toward the empty hallway beyond the glass doors. Somewhere inside the massive hospital, a man waiting for a life-saving heart operation had vanished from the surgical schedule without anyone noticing. Ethan slowly lowered the scalpel onto the tray. The metallic click echoed through the silent room. For the first time since anyone could remember, he looked directly at Nia Brooks without arrogance. Only disbelief. Before either of them could speak again, the overhead speaker crackled to life. Code Silver. Immediate lockdown. 1 surgical patient is missing. The lockdown alarm echoed through every hallway before the overhead lights shifted to a colder shade of white. Heavy security doors began sliding shut one by one with deep metallic thuds that rattled the walls. Inside operating room 7, nobody moved. The missing patient was no longer just a medical mistake. It was becoming something much darker. Ethan Caldwell stared at the electronic board as names and room numbers flashed across the screen. Seal every exit, he ordered. Nobody leaves this floor. His voice was firm again, but the tiny tremor beneath it did not escape Nia Brooks. She noticed everything. The nervous tapping of a resident's foot. The circulating nurse twisting her wedding band. The anesthesiologist wiping sweat from his forehead for the 3rd time in less than a minute. Something inside this hospital had already gone terribly wrong. Ethan turned toward Nia. You have done enough. His words landed like ice. Return to your station. A younger surgeon nodded in agreement, avoiding her eyes as though she had caused the chaos herself. For a brief moment, humiliation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The woman who had prevented a catastrophic mistake was suddenly being treated as the problem. Nia lowered her gaze, but only for a second. Then she noticed an empty wheelchair parked outside the operating room through the narrow window in the door. It should not have been there. She remembered passing that same chair nearly 20 minutes earlier near the cardiac elevators. It had been facing the opposite direction. Someone had moved it. "Doctor," she said quietly. Ethan did not even look at her. "Not now. That wheelchair." "Enough." The word cracked through the room louder than the alarm outside. Silence followed. The residents exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody dared speak again. Yet Nia could not shake the image from her mind. The wheelchair carried a bright blue transport tag tied beneath one handle. She remembered reading it while waiting for an elevator because the patient's granddaughter had decorated it with a tiny paper heart. Blue marker. Crooked handwriting. "Be brave, Grandpa." The wheelchair outside no longer had the paper heart. Her pulse quickened. "Someone removed it," she whispered almost to herself. Ethan finally looked over, frustration burning behind his eyes. "A missing decoration is not evidence." Before Nia could answer, hurried footsteps thundered down the hallway. 2 security officers rushed past the glass doors while another employee held up a tablet showing live surveillance footage. Several nurses gathered outside, whispering anxiously. A few visitors lifted their phones despite repeated warnings not to record. Fear spread faster than any announcement could control. Ethan stepped into the hallway, shoulders squared, determined to reclaim authority. Staff immediately made room for him. Nia remained just inside the operating room, watching reflections dance across stainless steel instruments beneath the surgical lights. Then she saw something no one else noticed. A transport blanket folded on a nearby cart carried a faint streak of bright orange disinfectant. That specific solution was only used in one place in the entire hospital. The isolation cardiac unit on the 12th floor. Her eyes widened. The missing transplant patient had never been scheduled anywhere near that unit. Someone had moved him there. Deliberately. Nia grabbed the blanket and hurried toward the doorway. "Dr. Caldwell!" she called. Ethan turned, clearly irritated that she had followed him. Every face in the hallway shifted toward her. "I know where they took him." For one long second nobody laughed. Nobody argued. Ethan slowly walked back toward her, his expression unreadable. He looked down at the stained blanket in her hands, then up into her eyes. Before he could speak, the security officer holding the surveillance tablet suddenly went pale. "Doctor," he whispered, "you need to see this." The screen showed the missing patient being wheeled through a restricted corridor, by someone wearing the exact same hospital badge as Nia Brooks. Every conversation in the hallway died the instant the surveillance image filled the tablet. The woman pushing the missing patient wore Nia Brooks's hospital badge, her navy scrubs, even her neatly tied curls beneath a surgical cap. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A phone camera lifted above someone's shoulder before security barked for everyone to put their devices away. Ethan Caldwell slowly turned toward Nia, his expression no longer angry but dangerously unreadable. "Explain this." His voice was quiet enough to make the silence even heavier. Nia stared at the screen, her pulse hammering against her throat. "That is not me," a resident scoffed under his breath. Another nurse took an uneasy step away from her. The distance hurt more than any accusation. Ethan extended his hand, and the security officer placed the tablet into it. He enlarged the image until every pixel blurred beneath the fluorescent lights. From a distance, it looked identical. Same badge. Same uniform. Same height. Same skin tone. The whispers grew louder. She distracted everyone. She planned this. She stopped the surgery on purpose. Each sentence landed like another weight on Nia's chest. She could feel every stare pressing against her, stripping away years of hard work in seconds. Ethan folded his arms. "Your badge." Without arguing, Nia unclipped it and handed it over. Ethan examined the photograph, then looked back at the surveillance image. "Close enough." "Too close." "Escort her to security," one administrator said from the end of the hallway. 2 officers immediately stepped forward. Nia did not resist. She only looked once more at the frozen frame on the tablet. Something refused to fit. Her breathing slowed. The hallway faded into a blur of polished floors, flashing alarms, and tense faces. She focused on one tiny detail. The identification badge in the image hung backward. Hers never did. Ever since her first day, she had clipped it facing inward because the plastic edge cracked her skin whenever it rubbed against her neck during 12-hour shifts. It had become a habit she never broke. "Stop." Her voice was calm, but it carried through the crowded corridor. Even the officers paused. Ethan frowned impatiently. "You have 1 minute." Nia stepped closer to the tablet without touching it. "Zoom in on the badge clip." A security technician hesitated before enlarging the image. The picture became grainy, but the clip remained visible. It was attached on the left side. Nia slowly lifted her own empty badge holder from her scrub pocket. The clip was permanently bent toward the right. "I cannot wear it the other way," she said softly. "It broke 3 years ago." Nobody spoke. Ethan looked from the screen to the damaged clip in her hand. Then back again. The confidence in the accusations began to crack. "That could still be coincidence," one administrator insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Nia shook her head. "Keep zooming." The technician obeyed. Metal reflected beneath the cold hallway lights. The image sharpened just enough to reveal the employee's shoes. Nia's eyes locked onto them instantly. "Those are operating room clogs," she whispered. "Mine are regular nursing shoes." Ethan looked down automatically. Nia's sneakers were still damp from the antiseptic floor cleaner, gray with blue trim. The figure on the screen wore expensive white surgical clogs reserved for physicians. The whispers stopped. Several residents exchanged uneasy looks. Someone had deliberately dressed to resemble Nia. Someone wanted every camera in the hospital to blame her. Ethan's breathing became heavier. For the first time that day, he looked less like the man in control and more like someone realizing he had been manipulated from the very beginning. Before he could say another word, the technician's face turned pale again. His fingers froze over the tablet. "Doctor," he whispered, "there is another camera angle." He tapped the screen, and the entire hallway watched as the disguised employee paused beneath a ceiling mirror for half a second. The surgical mask slipped just enough to reveal a familiar face. Ethan stared at it, and all the color vanished from his own. The hallway stood frozen as the technician replayed the footage one frame at a time. Every fluorescent light reflected across the tablet, every breath seemed trapped inside every chest, and the low mechanical hum of the hospital suddenly felt deafening. Ethan Caldwell stared without blinking. The face beneath the slipping mask was unmistakable. It belonged to Dr. Victor Langley, the hospital's director of surgical operations and Ethan's own mentor. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. One resident instinctively lowered the phone he had secretly been recording with. Another took a slow step backward as if the polished floor had suddenly become unstable. Ethan's jaw tightened. "That is impossible." His voice sounded smaller than before. The administrator beside him immediately shook his head. "The video is corrupted." But even he no longer believed his own words. Nia never took her eyes off the screen. "Play the next 5 seconds." The technician obeyed. The disguised figure pushed the unconscious patient through the restricted corridor, then glanced over one shoulder. There was no panic. No confusion. Only purpose. Then the figure used a security card that only executive surgeons were authorized to carry. A soft electronic click echoed from the tablet speakers. The restricted door opened without hesitation. Every executive standing nearby recognized the access point. Ethan felt something cold spread through his chest. That hallway led toward the private surgical research wing, a place ordinary staff could not enter without written approval. "Why would Victor be there?" one resident whispered. No one answered. A fresh wave of whispers rolled through the gathering crowd. Investors arriving for a scheduled hospital board meeting stood just beyond the security line, exchanging uneasy looks. Camera lenses slowly lifted again despite repeated warnings. The hospital's reputation was beginning to crack in real time. Ethan rubbed a trembling hand across his forehead. Every newspaper headline flashed through his mind before it had even been written. Wrong patient. Missing transplant recipient. Executive surgeon involved. His breathing became uneven. Years spent building his reputation suddenly felt frighteningly fragile. The administrator stepped closer. Dr. Caldwell, we need to contain this before anyone else sees the footage. Nia looked at him. Contain it? Her voice stayed calm, but every word carried weight. A man is missing. The administrator ignored her completely. Delete every unauthorized recording. Lock every entrance. Nobody speaks to the media. Nia realized then that they were still protecting the institution before the patient. Her stomach tightened. Somewhere beyond the sealed hallway, the heart transplant recipient was still losing precious time. The overhead clock ticked relentlessly. Every second mattered. Ethan looked down, unable to meet her eyes. For the first time all day, humiliation belonged to him instead of her. He had dismissed the only person who had seen the truth. He had almost cut open the wrong patient. He had nearly handed the real victim over to whoever was behind this. Yet before he could apologize, another alarm burst across the hospital speakers. Emergency power fluctuation detected in Research Wing C. The lights flickered once. Then again. Metallic ventilation panels rattled overhead as backup generators growled awake somewhere deep beneath the building. The vibration traveled through the polished floor into everyone's shoes. Nurses instinctively grabbed nearby equipment carts. The heart monitors inside the operating rooms chirped irregularly before stabilizing. Ethan's eyes widened. Research Wing C, he whispered. Nia was already moving. That is where they took him. One security officer reached for her arm. You are not authorized. She pulled free without force, her eyes fixed down the empty corridor glowing beneath cold white lights. If those generators fail, every life support unit in that wing switches to battery. Silence swallowed the hallway. Ethan finally looked at her not as a nurse, not as someone beneath him, but as the only person still seeing the entire picture. He took one step toward her. Brooks. His voice almost sounded like an apology. Before he could finish, every light on the floor suddenly went dark. Gasps echoed through the corridor. Phones became the only source of light. Somewhere deep inside the blackened hospital, a single terrified voice shouted, "The research lab door just opened by itself." Emergency lights flickered back to life one strip at a time, bathing the hallway in a cold blue glow that reflected across stainless steel carts and polished tile. The backup generators settled into a low, steady rumble somewhere beneath the building, replacing the chaos with an eerie mechanical heartbeat. Nobody spoke. The only sound was slow breathing and the faint vibration of phones still buzzing with unanswered calls. Every pair of eyes followed Nia Brooks as she stood perfectly still beneath the pale lights. She did not look frightened anymore. She looked focused. Ethan Caldwell watched her from several feet away, the weight of everything he had dismissed pressing visibly against his shoulders. For years, people had waited for him to tell them what was happening. Now he found himself waiting for a nurse to speak first. "What are you seeing?" he asked quietly. Nia did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned toward the dark corridor leading to Research Wing C. The air drifting from that direction felt warmer than the rest of the floor. She closed her eyes for a brief second, listening. Somewhere beyond the reinforced doors, a ventilation fan cycled unevenly. 3 seconds on. 1 second off. 3 seconds on again. Her eyes opened. Someone is still inside. Several residents exchanged uncertain glances. The security captain frowned. "You cannot know that." Nia slowly pointed toward the ceiling. "The ventilation pattern changed after the power came back. Those rooms only increase airflow when motion sensors detect someone inside." Silence settled over the hallway once again. The technician instinctively checked the environmental control panel on his tablet. His eyebrows lifted. She is right." A murmur rolled through the gathered staff. It was quiet this time. Different. Nobody was laughing anymore. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Every observation she had made since the morning had been dismissed before proving true. Every warning had arrived before the evidence. He replayed the day inside his mind and realized something unsettling. Nia had never guessed. She had only noticed what everyone else failed to see. His confidence continued slipping away, replaced by something unfamiliar. Respect. The administrator cleared his throat, desperate to regain control. That still does not explain why Victor Langley appeared on the cameras. Nia looked toward him without anger. Because you are asking the wrong question. He blinked. The right question is why he wanted everyone looking at me. No one replied. Those words hung in the still air heavier than the alarm had moments before. Even the officers standing beside the elevators exchanged uneasy looks. Ethan glanced back toward the frozen surveillance image still glowing on the tablet. The disguise. The copied badge. The identical uniform. None of it was meant to hide Victor's identity forever. It was meant to delay everyone just long enough by giving them someone easier to blame. His eyes slowly returned to Nia. She had been the distraction, not the suspect. A resident quietly lowered his head, ashamed of the accusations he had whispered only minutes earlier. One of the senior nurses stepped closer to Nia without saying a word, silently standing beside her instead of apart from her. The shift was almost invisible, but everyone felt it. The balance inside the hallway had changed. Ethan inhaled slowly. Brooks. This time her name carried no authority. Only regret. Before he could continue, Nia noticed a faint reflection moving across the polished metal frame of a supply cabinet. Someone had crossed the far end of the corridor where no one should have been. She narrowed her eyes. The figure disappeared almost instantly, but not before a silver access card caught the dim emergency light for half a heartbeat. There, she whispered. Every head turned. The corridor was empty again. No footsteps. No voices. Only the distant hum of machines and the slow ticking of the wall clock. Then every phone on the floor vibrated at the exact same moment with a hospital-wide emergency notification. Ethan unlocked his screen, and the color drained from his face as he read the single sentence that had just been sent to every employee in the building. Patient Daniel Harris has officially been declared deceased. Nia stared at the message without blinking. Then, almost inaudibly, she whispered, No, because I just saw him walking. Every face lifted from the glowing phone screens to Nia Brooks. The emergency notification still hung on every display like a final verdict. Patient Daniel Harris. Deceased. Yet her voice had not trembled. No, she repeated barely above a whisper. I saw him walking. A ripple of disbelief spread through the hallway. Someone let out a nervous laugh before it died in the heavy silence. Ethan Caldwell stared at her, searching for panic in her eyes, but found none. Only certainty. The cold emergency lights reflected across polished steel cabinets, while the backup generators rumbled beneath the floor like a distant storm. Explain, Ethan said quietly. Nia stepped toward the surveillance tablet without asking permission. Play the last hallway recording again. The technician obeyed. Grainy footage flickered across the screen. A patient in a hospital gown shuffled through the restricted corridor just seconds before disappearing beyond the camera's reach. Everyone had focused on the disguised surgeon. Nobody had looked at the patient. Nia leaned closer. Pause. The image froze. She pointed toward the man's left hand. Zoom in. Pixels sharpened one painful layer at a time. A silver wristwatch appeared beneath the hospital sleeve. Several doctors frowned immediately. Ethan's breathing slowed. Daniel Harris had surrendered every piece of jewelry before surgery. Every patient did. The watch should not have been there. That is not Daniel, Nia said. That is someone dressed like him. The words landed harder than the alarms ever had. A resident looked back at the electronic chart with wide eyes. Then, who is lying on the operating table? Nobody answered. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. For the first time in his career, every decision he had made that morning collapsed under its own weight. The wrong patient. The fake transfer. The false death notice. Someone had manipulated the entire hospital from the inside. One of the board members who had quietly arrived during the lockdown lowered his expensive leather briefcase onto the floor without realizing it. Investors exchanged stunned glances. Nobody cared about public relations anymore. They cared that the impossible had become real. Ethan looked toward Nia again. Hours earlier he had ordered her out of his operating room. Now every eye in the hallway waited for her next sentence. She knelt beside the abandoned transport chair near the wall. Her fingers brushed lightly across one wheel. Fresh moisture coated the rubber. She rubbed it between two gloved fingers. Cold. Then she touched the metal frame. Warm. Her eyes narrowed. This chair was used less than 2 minutes ago. The security captain frowned. How can you tell? The wheel came through disinfectant on the east corridor floor. She pointed toward a faint blue streak still clinging to the tire. But the metal is warm because it was parked beside the emergency generator room. Ethan slowly turned toward the building map hanging beside the elevators. His heartbeat pounded louder with every realization. The emergency generator room connected directly to a maintenance tunnel leading beneath Research Wing C. Nobody on the surgical staff had thought about maintenance access. Nobody except her. Open the tunnel, Ethan ordered. Security hesitated. Sir, that corridor has been sealed for years. Open it. His voice cracked with urgency instead of authority. The officers rushed away, their footsteps echoing through the silent hallway. Nobody mocked Nia now. Nobody questioned her observations. Even the nurses who had stepped away from her earlier quietly moved closer, forming an unspoken circle around her. One senior physician lowered his head in visible shame. Ethan swallowed hard. Brooks. He paused, struggling to force the words out. I should have listened. She met his eyes for only a moment. There was no triumph in her expression. No satisfaction. Only concern for the patient who was still somewhere beyond those walls. Before either of them could say another word, a deep metallic clang echoed through the ventilation shafts. The floor vibrated beneath everyone's feet. Then, from the far end of the corridor, the rusted maintenance door slowly swung open by itself. A single figure stepped into the pale blue emergency light, and every person in the hallway froze as Daniel Harris looked directly at Nia before collapsing one folded piece of paper onto the floor. The folded piece of paper hit the polished floor with a sound so soft that it somehow silenced the entire hallway. Nobody rushed forward. Nobody even breathed. Daniel Harris leaned against the cold concrete wall, exhausted but alive, while the pale blue emergency lights reflected across his tired face. Nia Brooks stepped toward him first, not with panic, but with the quiet confidence that had carried her through every accusation that day. She knelt beside him, her gloved hand lightly supporting his shoulder. You are safe now, she whispered. Daniel looked directly into her eyes and gave the smallest nod. Ethan Caldwell remained frozen several feet away. His expensive surgical gown suddenly felt unbearably heavy. The steady hum of the generators faded into the background as another sound took its place. Silence. The kind that arrives only when an entire room realizes it has been wrong. One of the investors slowly lowered his phone. Another removed his glasses, unable to hide the disbelief on his face. The security officers who had been ready to escort Nia away now instinctively stepped back, creating space around her instead of closing in. Nobody had asked them to. It simply felt wrong to stand in her way anymore. Daniel slowly pointed toward the folded paper still lying on the floor. Ethan bent down and picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a handwritten transfer authorization bearing Victor Langley's signature. Beneath it, another signature had been forged. Ethan's own. His breathing caught. Someone had not only manipulated the patients. They had intended to destroy his career forever. The realization hit him harder than any public humiliation ever could. He looked across the hallway at Nia. Hours earlier he had dismissed her with a glance. He had questioned her judgment, doubted her integrity, and nearly allowed his pride to silence the only person who had been telling the truth from the very beginning. A resident quietly removed his surgical cap, unable to meet her eyes. The administrator who had demanded her detention lowered his head in visible shame. Even the whispers had disappeared. The crowd no longer looked at Nia as the nurse who interrupted surgery. They looked at her as the woman who had quietly saved a patient's life, protected a surgeon's reputation, and uncovered a deception that every expert had missed. Ethan walked toward her slowly. Every footstep echoed through the corridor. When he finally stopped in front of her, his voice barely carried above the soft vibration of the machines. "Nurse Brooks." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was wrong." The words hung in the air with a weight no award or title could ever match. No one had ever heard Ethan Caldwell apologize in public. Not once. Nia looked up at him. There was no anger in her expression. No satisfaction. Only exhaustion and quiet compassion. "Right now," she said softly, "Daniel needs a doctor more than I need an apology." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second. The truth of those words settled over everyone standing there. Pride had nearly cost them everything. Compassion had saved what authority could not. Without another word, Ethan immediately turned to the trauma team. "Prepare intensive care. Full evaluation. Move now." This time nobody questioned the nurse who stood beside him. Several staff members instinctively looked toward Nia before moving, waiting for the smallest nod from her as if her calm had become the anchor holding the entire hospital together. One senior nurse quietly rested a hand on Nia's shoulder. Another offered her a fresh pair of gloves without saying a word. Respect no longer needed an announcement. It had already filled the hallway. As Daniel was gently wheeled toward intensive care, he reached into his blanket with unsteady fingers and caught Nia's sleeve one last time. His voice was barely audible. "There is one more name." Her eyes met his. Before he could finish the sentence, exhaustion overtook him, and his hands slipped away. The hallway became perfectly still again. Ethan looked from Daniel to the folded papers still clutched in his hand. Then he slowly turned it over. Written on the back, in hurried blue ink, were only 4 chilling words. "Do not trust Ethan." The words on the back of the paper seemed to absorb every sound in the hallway. "Do not trust Ethan." Nobody reached for the note. Nobody spoke. The emergency lights no longer flashed. They glowed steadily now, reflecting softly across stainless steel rails that had finally stopped trembling. Ethan Caldwell stared at the handwriting as though it belonged to another life. The weight in his chest had nothing to do with reputation anymore. It was something far more difficult to face. Doubt. Nia Brooks watched him quietly. She did not step away. She did not defend him. She simply looked from the note to Daniel Harris being rolled toward intensive care. "Finish helping him," she said gently. "The truth can wait another minute. His heartbeat cannot." Ethan slowly folded the paper. For the first time in his career, he obeyed someone without questioning why. "Move," he told the trauma team, his voice calm but changed. The nurses hurried forward. Residents followed without hesitation. As Daniel disappeared through the intensive care doors, the steady rhythm of a cardiac monitor echoed faintly from inside the unit. It sounded almost peaceful. The administrator who had demanded Nia's detention approached her, then stopped halfway. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and lowered his head instead. Nothing he could say felt large enough. One by one, the people who had doubted her stepped aside as she walked through the corridor. No announcement was made. No applause filled the hallway. The silence itself became the apology. Ethan remained where he stood until the corridor emptied. He looked down at his own hands, remembering how confidently they had reached for the scalpel that morning. One decision. One assumption. One moment of pride. He understood now how close he had come to destroying an innocent life because he had believed authority mattered more than listening. Soft footsteps approached behind him. Nia had returned, carrying the folded patient chart she had protected from the beginning. She held it out without a word. Ethan accepted it carefully. "Why did you stay?" he asked, his voice almost breaking. "After everything." Nia glanced through the window into the intensive care unit, where nurses adjusted blankets beneath the gentle morning light beginning to spill through the eastern glass. Because patients remember who stayed, she answered quietly. They rarely remember who won the argument. Ethan lowered his eyes. There was nothing left to defend. No title. No pride. Only gratitude. He straightened his shoulders and, for the first time in front of residents, administrators, investors, and every member of his surgical team, extended his hand toward her. Thank you, Nurse Brooks. The hallway fell completely still. It was not the handshake that stunned everyone. It was the title. He had finally spoken her name with the respect she had earned long before that day. Nia accepted the handshake with the same calm dignity she had carried from the beginning. No smile of victory crossed her face. Only quiet kindness. She released his hand first and gently adjusted the blanket on an elderly patient waiting nearby, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. A little girl sitting beside her grandfather watched the moment in silence before looking up at her mother. Is she the doctor? She whispered. Her mother smiled softly. No, she replied. She is someone who paid attention. Sunlight slowly pushed away the last traces of blue emergency light, filling the corridor with a warm golden glow that reflected across polished metal now resting in perfect stillness. Phones were lowered. Cameras stopped recording. The hallway that had begun with suspicion ended with quiet respect. As Nia walked toward her next patient, her footsteps faded into the gentle rhythm of distant heart monitors. No one called after her. No one needed to. Sometimes justice does not arrive with applause. Sometimes it walks quietly down a hospital hallway, carrying nothing more than compassion, while everyone else finally learns to listen.